So today, Julia is here with us.
Hello.
And Julia is a longtime friend of mine. We actually met, 6 years ago?
Should be.
At least. That's pretty crazy. And somehow we ended up on the same side of the Atlantic together, which is very exciting.
I'm pretty sure you copied me.
I think I did copy you. I think I did. Yeah, so to be honest, Julia is 2 years older than me. And everything she's done since I met her...
You've done better.
Maybe just 2 years later. So updated. We are both pursuing masters in linguistics. Myself at Cambridge and you at?
Oxford.
The other school, as they say.
Ew.
Ew. Who even cares? Pretty much, I have a theory that they're secretly just the same school. That maybe the tension is just like for fun or something like that.
Yeah, and all the atoms have just been like copied and transferred.
100%.
I agree. Everyone's a lizard.
But her research is about 4,000 times cooler than my own, which is why we brought her on the show, so that she can talk about it. And I'm very, very excited that you're here.
Thanks for having me.
So Julia's research is about 4,000 times cooler than that of my own. And she happens to be working on a very interesting language, the name of which is?
Well, it has a lot of names. Can I just give you all of them?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, here we go. So I grew up learning that this language was called Ladino, which is correct, also potentially incorrect. Debatable. Okay. We'll see. Other names include Judeo-Spanish, if you're speaking English, Judeo-Español, if you're speaking Spanish, Nuestro Español, which translates to our Spanish. So it's the idea that it's a dialect of Spanish or a variety of Spanish spoken by a specific community. Okay. And Judesmo is another one that generally refers to varieties spoken in the former Ottoman Empire. I'll get to that in a second.
Cool.
And then another variety, which is a bit different from the one I work on, is called Heketia, which comes from the Arabic root heki, or to tell. So all of these are varieties of Spanish spoken by Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492, which was a particularly bad year in the history of the world. Looking at you, Spain. But what happened then is that after the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella and the reconquest, as they called it, of the Iberian Peninsula as a Catholic nation, which of course they combined with colonialism elsewhere, they expelled Muslims and Jews, or required them to convert to Catholicism. Some Jews do convert, others pretend to convert and stay in the peninsula, but about 150,000 leave. Muslims, of course, had to go through the same thing. So the Jews go in waves to many different places, kind of loosely around the Mediterranean. One wave goes down to Morocco, where they continue speaking Spanish, and then it gets mixed with Moroccan Arabics, hence why it's called Heketia, which comes from the Arabic word. And then the plurality, so about 100,000 Jews go to the Ottoman Empire. What was the Ottoman Empire? Actually, because they were invited specifically by the Sultan Bayezid II, who explicitly invited Jews to come, promised them a level of security and employment and participation in the empire's sort of workings. Spoiler, that's the variety I work on. And then some other Jews end up going to areas in Western Europe, like Amsterdam in particular, some to what is now England. The variety I work on goes by the name of either Judesmo or Judeo-Español. Some of the speakers do call it Español, but it is quite a special variety of basically what stems from 15th century Spanish, but then has evolved on its own, of course, and also mixed with Turkish, mixed with Greek, mixed with French because of some funky history in the 19th century that I'll get to, has taken a little bit from Arabic, and then of course has the influence from Hebrew, which Jews have always infused in languages they speak wherever they are to talk about ritual elements and things like that. And then the first name I talked about, Ladino, is what I grew up understanding the language to be called. But that even refers to a different variety of this language, which is a syntactic calque of Hebrew, which means that for a long time, so totally separate from the spoken language that I'm interested in. There has been a written language whereby Jews from the Spanish-speaking world, the Iberian Peninsula, translated Hebrew liturgical texts directly into Spanish, preserving the syntax of Hebrew. So you can imagine what that looks like. And that continues to exist, but actually doesn't have, there's no one-to-one relationship between the spoken language, which looks a lot syntactically more like Spanish, and this syntactic calque. So growing up in my synagogue back home in Washington, D.C., we would learn a couple Ladino songs, maybe bits of prayers in what is I now know to be Judeo-Spanish, but not a lot about the language. I really grew up learning that Yiddish was a major Jewish language that I should know about, besides Hebrew, but I didn't know that there was this just immense diversity of Sephardic varieties and dialects, and that the language was so rich and so spread across the world. So it's been really exciting to sort of connect with a language that Jewish people, other places in the world, and even back at home, speak and have been speaking for 500 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
A lot of languages involved in this language, it seems.
It's a bit meta. It's a box of languages. So this helps me hone in on the dialect the variety that I work on, which is the variety of Istanbul. So as I said, the Ottoman Sultan, invites Jews to go to the Ottoman Empire, and they sort of spread across the Ottoman Empire, which was massive at the time, but then kind of eventually tend to gather in Istanbul and a couple other cities in what is now Turkey, but a really large concentration of Jews in Istanbul. And the Jewish communities of Istanbul were fairly kind of insular, set up around synagogues. They didn't actually speak Turkish for quite a long time. Judeo-Spanish was the language of their lives. And then in around 1860s, a network of French Jews called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Universal Israelite Alliance, sets up schools across sort of the Levant, the Middle East, Iran, basically parts of the Jewish world that were considered Oriental, Eastern at the time, and by extension, and through the lens of imperialism, were considered uncivilized and needing of integration into Western European linguistic and cultural norms. So these are sort of dynamic within the Jewish world of imperialism imposed upon Jews of the Eastern Mediterranean. And what that looked like was a network of schools meant for Jews that not only had their sole language of instruction as French, but also would explicitly discourage the use of Jewish languages like Judeo-Spanish, like Hekatiya, like Judeo-Persian, like Judeo-Arabic. They would take out, there's sort of full page ads in the Istanbul newspapers saying things to the extent in the likes of stop speaking Ladino, it's not a real language, speak French. An interesting sort of imposition that was then echoed later in 1923 by the Turkish Republic, which was saying, stop speaking Ladino, French isn't even that great either, citizens speak Turkish. So there's all these layers in the lives of Istanbulite and sort of Sephardic Jews of the former Ottoman Empire in particular, in which they're told that their language is not viable, that it's not legitimate, that it's not civilized, that it's not Jewish, even though French is hardly a Jewish language. But for many people, there were just generations of Jews that in Istanbul that were equally proficient in French, Turkish, and Ladino, and many of them have adopted sort of all of those languages part of their daily lives. Many of the speakers that I met and whose kind of speech I work with view French as one of the languages of their family. So it's a complicated relationship. But when they do speak Ladino, lots of interesting sort of French elements enter as well as Turkish.
It's kind of amazing that this language has persisted despite so many oppressive forces trying to get it to die out, right? But nevertheless, it's still around, which is amazing. And are the different dialects spoken throughout the world mutually intelligible at this point, or are they too distant?
There's kind of been a second layer of diaspora, you could say, or from places in which Judeo-Spanish developed as a language. So sort of it developed in the areas where Jews fled Spain. It has now continued to evolve in North America, in the state of Israel, which has the largest number of Ladino speakers, where there it's also discouraged because the use of modern Hebrew is considered preferable under the specific nationalism of that country. And so they've received so much contact with other languages. Also, there's amazing papers and projects in the US on the interaction, you'll love this, the interaction between Sephardic Jews who speak Ladino and speakers of like Latin American Spanish in New York and in Los Angeles. So there's contact between like two different varieties of Spanish, one of which sounds much older. And the question of whether they're mutually intelligible is a good one. That depends on who's speaking, sort of how many borrowings they're letting in, how much contact they're letting in from all the sort of languages I've referred to, and the Turkish borrowings that have entered in the Ladino of Turkey, and the Moroccan Arabic borrowings that have entered into the Haketiya of Morocco, those of course would not translate so well. Right. But what I'm finding in my research is that after 500 years, there's shockingly little imported into the language from Turkish and French that we would sort of contrary to what we would expect. So there's a healthy number of lexical borrowings for borrowed words for things you might expect, like the Turkish military service and identity card and sort of objects around the house. Sure. But there's very little structural borrowing that would make it really difficult to understand the language for a speaker of another variety on sort of a structural level. Wow. So I would say tentatively, yes. And that's what sort of makes Sephardic communities in the second layer of diaspora. Let's talk about the ones in North America, for example. That's what makes them sort of able to be coherent, because they might speak different varieties of Judeo-Spanish, but they're mostly intelligible and they do sort of forge a common identity.
Okay, so let's focus on the specific dialect that you've been looking at for your thesis. So this is based in Istanbul?
The Istanbul variety, okay. Yeah.
And then elsewhere throughout Turkey as well, or is it based solely in Istanbul?
There's kind of two other major sites, in Izmir and Edirne, another city. But the Istanbul variety definitely has the most speakers. If you're going to ask me how many, it's that we don't know. And a lot of the estimates are considered potentially too high because the younger generation simply aren't learning the language anymore. So although we might have between 10 and 15,000 Jews in Istanbul right now, if you ask how many people are fluent speakers of Istanbul Judeo-Spanish, it might be in the low thousands. It might also be in the hundreds. So it's really hard to estimate.
But almost certainly not a first language for anyone living in Istanbul.
For the younger generation now, it would be rare for it to be one of the mother tongues. But for sort of the middle-aged and older generation, it might be one among three or two mother tongues, but there are no monolingual speakers of Istanbul Judeo-Spanish. And that has sort of been the case for a couple generations now. So everyone also speaks Turkish fluently. Most Sephardic Jews, young Sephardic Jews, to my understanding, would call Turkish their first language. But in the corpus that I work with, which are the folks who are in their 80s and 90s and who are native speakers of Istanbul Judeo-Spanish, they consider Istanbul Judeo-Spanish their mother tongue, and then Turkish and French were kind of additional native languages.
So given the fact that no one is a monolingual speaker anymore, I'm going to throw a term out that is ill-defined, but would one call Judeo-Spanish an endangered language, a dying language?
One of the sort of reference texts on Judeo-Spanish, at least in English, is titled, I think quite boldly, Death of a Language, like Ladino. Okay, so. And that was published in 1994. Which is, 25 years ago. And that predicted that the language had a couple years to live, basically, or maybe a decade. And I think the idea of a dead and dying language it's a bit difficult for sort of linguists who aren't part of a community to impose as terminology on a community. There are even sort of the Miami Nation in the United States had what was called by others a dead language, and then through a process of Miami-led reclamation, brought it back, and then the leaders of that project proposed that the language should be retroactively called a dormant language. So the question of whether a language can truly die is a question, because it is up to speakers to potentially revitalize it, and that can happen at various points in the future. Istanbul Judeo-Spanish is most certainly not a dead language if we're defining that as a language without any native speakers. The major sort of property we look at when we think about endangerment is what the younger generation is doing. And it just is the case that the younger generation isn't learning the language natively. There's a lot of factors going into that, and that kind of all started in 1923 when Turkish was mandated the language of all schools in Turkey. This was at the dawn of the founding of the Republic of Turkey. And the Sephardic Jewish community now had to have schooling in Turkish. And as I said, like, some of it was also happening in French. And so Istanbul Judeo-Spanish lost one of its major contexts, which was sort of the educational realm. And then the other major realm, which is the home, has also been declining because of feelings that it's not the language of the state they're living in, the nation they're living in. And there is, however, a growing awareness, I think, right now, that the language is on the verge of not having young speakers, and that the older speakers are aging. And so the organization called the Ottoman Turkish Sephardic Cultural Research Center, which is totally fantastic and run by amazing native speakers of the language in Istanbul, are starting all these really interesting projects that are quite innovative and aimed at the younger generation to make sure that young people are learning to speak it. And some of these are pretty creative. They're like international WhatsApp groups with like hundreds of people who may or may not be Sephardic, who are getting daily lessons through WhatsApp, through audio messages, through interesting graphics that teach them the grammar, teach them expressions. There's sort of the publication of children's books and comics. Judeo-Spanish has this amazing tradition of funny stories and proverbs that are kind of like asking to be read by children and parents and families. So they have a lot of sort of tools at their dispense. I think death of the language was sort of a prescient and quite negative like painting of the linguistic situation. And I think there is a lot of hope. I think there's just more talk generally about the sort of value of minority languages and why we should keep them around. Wow,
that's great. Okay, so there are revitalization efforts currently undergoing. That's great. Is it taught in schools or?
It's not taught in schools, but there are these sort of lessons put on by the organization that I mentioned. They publish a weekly newspaper, and then back in the States, even sort of away from where the language evolved. There are projects run by Sephardic folks to make sure the language is celebrated and taught. I would say that these projects are accelerating, and that there's a growing awareness.
Right. That's wonderful. So Judeo-Spanish, well, death of a language definitely was a little bit presumptory.
Oof.
Oof. Just incorrect, though, also, right? And like, this is such a hopeful language. I think that's great.
Yeah, and I think, so my thesis was kind of looking at whether, this language has imported so much from Turkish and French, and whether that it might have lost quite a bit structurally, syntactically, and morphologically, or whether it has whether its systems are intact. And so what I looked at is what the language does when it borrows from Turkish and French, which are kind of the major source donor languages, we can say. And what I'm finding and what I found is that Judeo-Spanish grammatical systems are sort of so intact that they nearly consistently integrate, as we say, Turkish and French borrowings on lots of counts. So nouns from Turkish which don't have grammatical gender get assigned gender based on very specific rules in Judeo-Spanish. Verbs from Turkish get like bunged right into a Judeo-Spanish verb paradigm, no questions. So like a Turkish verb like kullanmak, to make use of, becomes kullanear. So someone can say like a guy is talking about like some like clothes he got for his bar mitzvah, I think, and he was like, los chamechiricos, años y años, los culaneemos, which used like 2 Turkish borrowings. He's saying like, those little clothes, like we use them for years and years. And he used like 2 Turkish borrowings, but he put like the Judeo-Spanish diminutive suffix, chamachiricos, the little clothes. Okay. And then he took a Turkish verb, kulanear, and made it into a Judeo-Spanish verb that has like very recognizably Judeo-Spanish morphology.
Wow.
So although like the language is sort of in contact all the time and receiving influences from other languages, it's also very much still Judeo-Spanish,
it seems like
systematically.
Kind of a strong language that's like being able to like fight all of these different people.
Yeah, and I think like, language contact is never really about like, competition between 2 languages until the question of power comes in, right?
Yeah.
So what you have to look at is sort of the sociolinguistic situation whereby like, one language is the majority language of the state that has particular policies, trying to increase sort of its speakership, if you will, and this other minority languages is sort of in a minority community that is is not powerful in the same way. So at that point, it does become a bit of a competition in the linguistic landscape. Yeah. And what we're seeing is that like people are multilingual, that the language is adapting grammatically, and that it's also like very much adapting on its own terms.
That's wonderful. So it must be hopeful to see a language so closely that is kind of bouncing back all of a sudden and being persistent. But as both of us know, that's not the case with all languages. Language endangerment goes beyond revitalization. Sometimes there's, well, you know more about this than I do. So I will ask you, for our audience, can you answer the question like, what does it mean? What does it matter if a language dies? I think a lot of people might respond to a topic of language endangerment as, okay, well, they're speaking something else, so what's the big deal? But what is lost when a language is lost?
So there are kind of 2 major answers, and one is what a linguist would say. A linguist who might not particularly be in touch with the speaker community. From a very like a purely linguistic standpoint, we can say every language has its own unique phonological, syntactic, morphological systems that, by definition of being a language, works differently from all the other ones, might encode different patterns and information that we can learn from, even lexically, even in terms of the vocabulary, might have words that we might lose. That's a quite sort of functional view of languages, right? And I think it has some validity. But then, on the other hand, and something that sort of is more powerful, more compelling to me, is that language is part of a nexus of factors that make up the identity of a community. And when a language isn't doing well, when a language is being minoritized, there is no situation in which the community of speakers is not also being minoritized, stigmatized, or oppressed in another way. That might be politically, that might be socioeconomically, that might be in terms of loss of land, that might be in terms of forced migration. It could be an extreme case such as war or genocide. That's one of the major ways that languages are wiped out, but it also could be sort of an incremental push of loss of economic opportunity because the government of the community they're in isn't prioritizing sort of policies to make sure that their region is economically viable. There also is, of course, cases of colonization and then neo-colonialism. And so what we're seeing when a language is dying or becoming endangered is often the endangerment of a people and the endangerment of a community. And speakers who are fighting for the vitality of their language are almost never just fighting for the vitality of their language, and they're quite explicit about that. So many revitalization movements are part of wider movements for political autonomy, for autonomy over land, resources. So when we say, what does it matter if a language dies, we're talking about their people. A language doesn't exist without speakers, right? So if we're concerned about a language, we're concerned about the community. And that also means that when we as linguists work with community, we can't be working in a sort of linguistic vacuum where we're hoping to just make sure the data lives on. We need to also be making sure the people are empowered and healthy and given the autonomy that they're asking for. Yeah.
So what can people in academia do to prevent language death and all of the horrible consequences that come with it?
Yeah, so I think number one, you listen, right? So there's lots of different ways that I could make a list of ways that linguists have in the past worked on language revitalization or reclamation and contributed to it. But that doesn't mean that every linguist should do all of those things for every community that has an endangered language. So I'd say the first thing is that it's a process of consultation by which a community asks a linguist to be involved. And then revitalization will look different for every community based on sort of, are they fragmented across a large area? Are they quite insular? What's the situation in terms of technology? What's the situation in terms of the political situation or education in that community? What are the channels by which revitalization can happen? And this is kind of why I got into linguistics in the first place. I was doing archaeology for the extent of my undergrad and seeing that there weren't amazing relationships, this is an understatement, between communities working with archaeologists. Not in all cases, but in many cases, there wasn't sort of a two-way street by which a community working with an archaeologist was able to benefit from that work. Often the archaeologists would do their work and go away. Mm-hmm. And there might be some sort of consultation or talking, but ultimately. And what I saw when I took my first language documentation course was that we sat down with a native speaker, talked through what might make sense to do with what might make sense with the audio data we had collected on her language. What would make sense for the sort of folks back home? It was a community in Eastern Turkey. And she thought a children's book might make a lot of sense because the language was becoming endangered. And the process of working on that children's book really showed me that that what a linguist can do with a certain set of skills can be in full collaboration with members of endangered speaker communities. So that might be resource development for teaching, that might be political lobbying, that might be other projects on the ground that mostly have to do, again, with the younger generation.
Lots of good ideas for people who are in linguistics or in any kind of academic setting. What about for those who have kind of no background in linguistics whatsoever, like someone who is listening right now and has never heard about dying languages, but now wants to do something about it? What would you tell them so that they could get involved? Yeah.
So the first thing you can do is, everyone is born somewhere, everyone's living somewhere right now. Where you are living or where you were born, depending on where you are in the world, was likely the site of another language in the past, particularly if you're in the Americas. There is a fantastic language map of the Americas that shows you approximately where, of course, because there's about 10,000 years of linguistic history, that's hard to represent, but at some point, what languages were spoken on the land in which you live, and the land maybe where you work, and the land where you went to university, and the land where you were born. I would highly suggest looking all of those up, learning their names, potentially researching a bit more about one of them. And if they happen to have a revitalization effort going on, like, for example, there's quite a few immersion schools in the Native American nations across the United States, as well as what is now Canada, same for South America. You could make a donation to one of those right now. You could read some of their resources. Sometimes they're called language nests. Here in Europe, we're sitting right here in the UK, where Celtic languages such as Gaelic and Cornish, which is doing even worse, were once spoken on these lands. And if you're sitting here and you're not a linguist and you're wondering how you can help, you can sort of look up the revitalization projects right here in the UK.
That's wonderful. Great news for everyone who is obviously going to be so interested in what you have to
Yes,
say.
I'm sure.
No
Fascinated.
question. People are already Googling as we're talking.
Okay, wait. In Wales, like part of the language activism in the '60s was like scratching out all the street signs, but then also like refusing to pay taxes until the tax forms themselves were translated into Welsh, and it worked.
Wow.
So might want to get
Good
involved.
tactics,
Yeah, you don't have to pay
yeah.
your taxes. It's great.
So fun. So my final question is personal, but not too personal. What is in the future for you? So you're approaching the end of this 2-year master's.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Turning in the thesis very soon.
Uh-huh.
And what comes after, maybe? Who knows?
Yeah, so I'll be relocating right here to Cambridge, the site of much interesting linguistic research and work. Cambridge has a bunch of wonderful professors involved in minority languages and standardization who I might love to work with. Otherwise, I'm really also interested in the public education side of things. So that means involvement mostly in museums and making sure that museum exhibits are reflective of things like issues in endangered language and endangered culture and heritage. So that could be really interesting, and Cambridge is a pretty good place for that. So
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. This was fascinating. I thought I knew everything about this subject, and turns out I knew about 20% of it. So
you didn't know about Istanbul-Judeo-Spanish?
not everything. I knew about the French, but no, I'm just kidding. I didn't know anything. Yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I'm sure people are going to be fascinated by what you had to say.
Gracias.